In the beginning there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void. From the void came fire and ice clash and melting spark and silence. And from that meeting, the first giants crawled into being vast and terrible. Ymir, the frost giant, was the first, the father of monsters. From the sweat of his armpits and the twitch of his limbs came legions. And in the midst of that chaos, something else stirred a line, different, clean, seeking not destruction, but shape. From Bor and Bestla came three brothers, Vili Ve and Odin. And it was Odin who would carve the cosmos from the bones of Ymir, who would raise the sky with his hands and bind the earth with will, who would shape Midgard for mankind, not as a gift, but as a mirror. But gods, even in their beginnings, are not born wise, they are born hungry. And none hungered more deeply than Odin. From the moment he opened his eye to the light of the newborn cosmos, Odin craved understanding. Not merely knowledge, not the names of stars or the patterns of root and branch, but the bone-deep knowing of why it all was. What was the order behind the chaos, the rhythm beneath the sky's thunder, the truth under the veil of gods and giants? Odin was king, and kings demand certainty. But there was none in the world he ruled, only omen and shadow. He saw that even gods die, that prophecy wove tighter than chains, that fate moved like a serpent no sword could slay. And he feared not for himself, but for the ignorance that would one day doom them all. So Odin began to walk. He walked away from the high throne of Hlidskjalf, away from Asgard's golden halls, away from the laughter of Thor, the council of Frigg, the feasts of Valhalla. He wore a wide-brimmed hat to shade the light of his eye, and a cloak grey as ash, and he carried a staff carved with runes not yet known. The world did not recognize him as king, for he no longer moved like one. He moved like a question. His first journey took him to the edge of the Well of Urd, where the three Norns spun fate at the roots of Yggdrasil. Urd Verdandi schooled past, present, future three sisters, older than time, whose fingers bled wisdom into the threads they wove. Odin knelt before them, a god in humility, and asked for a single strand to read. But they laughed, their mouths full of starlight and sorrow. "We do not show the threads," said Urd, "we weave them. We do not teach the pattern," said Verdandi, "we maintain it. You may touch the thread," whispered Skuld, "but it will cost you blood." And with that they gave him nothing. Still, Odin watched. He watched how the threads twisted, how the loom moved without hands, how each choice echoed through the weave like thunder beneath ice. He did not blink for 9 days and 9 nights, and when he closed his eye at last, he saw differently, not clearly, but deeper. He saw that fate was not a river, but a tree. That paths split. That choices could bend, not break, what had once seemed destined. But this was not enough. The hunger still burned. He left the Norns behind and wandered further deep into Jotunheim, land of the giants, where the mountains speak and the stones listen. There Odin sought Mimir, Mimir the ancient, the guardian of the well of wisdom. Mimir, who drank from waters so deep, they remembered creation's scream. Mimir, whose head would one day speak long after his body was gone. He sat beside the well that bore his name, and when Odin came to him, he did not rise. He only nodded. He knew why the Allfather had come. Odin did not ask politely. He did not flatter. He did not threaten. He simply offered. "My eye for a drink," he said. "The left. I need the right." Mimir looked upon him, saw the truth of the offer, and nodded again. Odin took a knife from his belt. It was not ceremonial. It was cruel, curved iron. With no spell, no glamour, he gouged out his eye and dropped it into the well. It sank like a red star, leaving ripples that never stopped. Then he cupped the water in his hands and drank. It tasted of rot and salt, of tears and fire, of the breath of dying worlds and the laughter of things unborn. It filled his mouth with screams and silence, and when he blinked with one eye now, the world changed. He saw the threads of fate curling through every being. He saw his death tangled in a wolf's jaws. He saw Thor's hammer break the world serpent's skull. He saw fire devouring sky. He saw himself upon the gallows, not dead but offering. He saw that knowledge was not power, It was cost, and he would pay again and again. From that day forward, Odin walked not as king, but as sacrifice. He returned to Asgard not in triumph, but in silence. The gods looked upon his missing eye and asked nothing, for they saw in its absence a warning. He spoke less, listened more. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew farther, whispering truths he never shared. He built Valhalla not as a haven, but as a fortress against doom. He gathered the dead not to honor them, but to ready them for a battle he could not win. But still it was not enough. Wisdom once tasted is a hunger that never ends. And Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, would walk again. The eye was gone, and with it, illusion. Odin returned to the halls of Asgard with one less window into the world, but 1,000 more within. He no longer spoke as freely, for he now knew how dangerous words could become once spoken. He sat upon his high seat, Hlidskjalf, and gazed across the 9 realms, with a silence that unnerved even the boldest gods. Thor still laughed and drank, Frigg still weaved her unseen visions, and Loki still whispered behind smiling teeth. But Odin saw the shape beneath the faces, the threads beneath the flesh, and he knew that the wisdom he had taken from Mimir's well was not the summit, it was the threshold. And so the hunger returned, not for more knowledge, but for understanding. What use was seeing fate if one could not change it? What use was knowing the end if the end was unyielding? The knowledge of his death, of the death of gods, of the burning of Yggdrasil, and the drowning of Midgard, all of it had now taken root in him like a splinter that would not heal. And from that wound, another path opened darker and more terrible than the one before. Odin would seek not just to learn the runes of power, but to earn them. He would claim wisdom not through transaction, but through ordeal. And there was only one place in all the realms that could offer him what he sought. He turned to Yggdrasil, the world tree older than time, whose roots drink from 3 wells, whose branches cradle the stars. A tree that held all 9 realms in its reach, Asgard, Midgard, Hel, and beyond. It did not move, but it lived. It did not speak, but it remembered. And Odin had gazed upon it since the shaping of the world, and knew in his soul that to ask it for knowledge was not to beg, but to bleed. So he prepared not a ritual but a death. He approached the tree not as a king, but as a question, with no followers, no witness but the tree itself. He took the spear Gungnir in his own hand. He climbed its roots like stairs carved from thunder, and when he reached the branch that hung above the void, he made a noose of thought and tied it around his neck. He stabbed himself with the spear, not in battle, not in rage, but in offering. And he hung. 9 nights, 9 days. No food, no drink, no rest, no mercy. He hung not as a god, but as sacrifice. He dangled between the worlds, between life and death, between breath and silence. The stars ignored him. The wind forgot him. The tree held him without love or cruelty. And in that place, stripped of flesh, stripped of name, Odin reached beyond. He saw the runes, not drawn, not spoken, but birthed in pain. They came to him not as symbols, but as revelations, as raw truths, carved into the essence of being. Each rune was a key, each line a door. He saw how sound could shape fate, how words could bind the unbindable. He learned the songs of healing, of breaking chains, of calling winds and banishing death. He learned the charms that twisted minds and soothed hearts. He saw the weave behind all weaves and touched it, and it changed him. When the 9th night ended, the noose broke not by his hand, but by the will of the tree. He fell not to earth, but into awakening. He was no longer simply Odin. He was the rune lord, the spell speaker, the one who knew that wisdom is pain, given purpose. He stood beneath Yggdrasil and did not thank it, for the tree does not give. It endures, it remembers, and now it remembered him. He returned to Asgard, his cloak torn, his flesh pale, his spear humming with the memory of sacrifice. The gods gathered to ask what had happened, what vision he had seen. But he did not speak of the tree, not fully. Some truths once spoken lose their weight. Instead, he began to teach, not openly, not grandly, but in signs, in moments, in choices. He guided without ruling. He led without chains. He passed the runes to mortals, not all but some. Those who listened to wind, who stared into fire too long, who dreamed of names never spoken. And in doing so, he gave power not only to gods, but to those who could challenge them. He did not fear it. He welcomed it, for he knew that power hoarded is rot. Yet even then, even with the runes burned into his soul, the hunger had not died, because the more he knew, the more he saw the vastness of what he could never know. That was the true curse of wisdom. It does not end. It grows. It devours certainty. It leaves you wandering, always seeking the shape behind the shape. And in that hunger, a new question burned brighter than the rest. Was fate absolute, or could it be broken? The tree had shown him the end. The well had shown him the cost. But was there something older still? A place where destiny had not yet hardened into law. Odin, the one-eyed, the rune lord, the wanderer, looked to the edge of things again, and began walking once more. Odin walked again. The eye he had lost no longer wept, and the runes that burned within his soul no longer screamed. Yet the silence that followed wisdom was heavier than ignorance ever was. Asgard still stood. The gods still thrived. But beneath the golden walls and feasting tables, Odin saw cracks, hairline fractures in the myth of their invincibility. He knew Ragnarok would come. He had seen it in the well. He had sung it hanging from the tree. He had traced it in the flight of ravens and the tremble in the wind. But he also knew something deeper, something far more dangerous, that fate, while written, could be read differently. Not denied, but reshaped. And so he searched not for more power, but for the one who whispered behind death. He journeyed again, leaving the high throne of Hlidskjalf behind, leaving Frigg in her quiet mourning, and Thor in his storm-bound pride. He took no retinue, no fanfare, only ravens overhead and wolves at his heels. He followed no road, because no road leads to death willingly. He walked where frost never melts, where light forgets to linger, where words curl into themselves and disappear. He walked toward the mouth of Helheim, the realm of the dead. Not the battlefield dead. Those belonged to Valhalla. They were sung, feasted, and readied for the final war. But the others, the old, the broken, the forgotten, fell to hell. The half-living daughter of Loki, queen of shadows and silence. Hell, whose face was beauty and rot, who smiled with half a mouth and ruled without joy or cruelty. Odin did not fear her. He feared what she kept. The gate was not locked. Hell had no need of locks. The living did not enter, and the dead did not leave. But Odin stepped through, and the air changed. It tasted of stone, of stillness, of breath that had long ago become memory. Shadows moved without bodies. Names flickered in the dark, only to vanish. And in the center, upon a throne of bone and frost, sat Hel. She did not rise. She did not speak. She simply watched as Odin approached. He bowed not out of submission, but of respect. For this was a realm not of enemy, but of truth. I seek what death remembers, he said. Hel said nothing. I seek what lives beneath fate, he continued. What speaks after the song ends. Still she said nothing, but the silence tightened. It wrapped around him like roots, thick with the weight of the forgotten. And then behind him, a voice spoke. It was not hers. It was older, colder, hungrier. It was Mimir, not the body. That had long been gone. But the head, his head wise and watchful, carried by Odin in later days, was kept here in the realm where all things end. It spoke without mouth, whispered without breath. You come again, it said, not for knowledge, but to undo its price. Odin did not deny it. I seek the truth behind truth, he said. Not prophecy, not poetry, truth. Mimir laughed, and the sound cracked the stone beneath Odin's feet. There is no truth but death, the voice replied. All other truths rot. Odin stepped closer. Then show me. And so the dead did. Not in visions, but in presence. They came to him bolder, still radiant even in stillness. Hodder eyes dark with regret. The countless mortals who had died in silence, who bore no songs, who had no stories. They did not blame. They did not weep. They simply existed, shadows of what had once moved with breath and need. Odin saw in them the shape of legacy, of consequence of what the gods had taken and forgotten. He saw that wisdom was not knowledge gained, but weight carried. He saw that every rune he carved came with a cost not paid by him alone. He saw that the gods had been drunk on their own light, while their shadows grew long and cold. And he wept not with sorrow, but with clarity. Hel finally spoke. "What will you do with what you know?" Odin looked at her, at the realm of silence, at the faces who waited not for salvation, but for justice. "I will remember," he said. She nodded once. "Then go." And with that, the shadows receded. Odin left Helheim not with treasure, not with power, but with truth that scraped the bone. He returned to Asgard not triumphant, but changed. He looked at the gods not as companions, but as risks. He looked at mortals not as worshippers, but as echoes. He began to build, not just for battle, but for survival. He whispered to Volvas, the seeresses of Midgard. He gave knowledge to witches and wanderers, knowing they might one day teach what gods had forgotten. He watched the sons of men and wondered which would rise. He saw in the eyes of children a question no god could answer. Why must it end? And still he could not stop fate. He had seen the wolf. He had seen the fire. He had seen his own blood spilled beneath Fenrir's jaws. But now he knew this wisdom is not the power to stop fate. Wisdom is the courage to meet it, and the cunning to leave something behind. He would not live forever, but perhaps something better would, and so he waited not for victory, but for the moment he could plant one more truth before the end. The sky was heavy, as if it too had heard what Odin had heard in the silence of death. Even the stars, eternal sentinels of night, seemed dimmer, watching him with unease. He had returned from Helheim, not with fire, nor prophecy, nor weapon, but with understanding, and understanding he now saw was more dangerous than any sword, because it demanded action, because it did not allow him to look away. Odin sat once more upon Hlidskjalf, the high seat of Asgard, and looked out over the 9 realms. But the view had changed, not in what was there, but in what he now saw. He saw a tree that groaned under too much weight, a people, gods and mortals alike, who built walls around their comfort and called it order. A silence that grew louder with each passing generation, screaming of what was to come. And so he began to prepare. Not to stop Ragnarok, he knew that was impossible. The future might bend, but it would not break. The wolf would come. The serpent would rise, the fire would burn, the gods would fall. Odin's death was carved into the roots of Yggdrasil, etched into the stars sung by every Volva who dared speak of the end. But what came after, that was unwritten. That was his last quest. He did not tell the gods. They would not understand. Not Thor, who still believed the strength of his arm could hold back the end. Not Frigg, whose silence had grown deeper than Hel's. Not Tyr, not Baldur, not Heimdall. He told only the ravens Hugin, who flew with thought, and Munin, who flew with memory. He sent them far and wide, not to gather news, but to plant it. He whispered truths to mortals disguised as riddles. He visited Volvas in dreams, gave them fragments of songs never yet sung. He taught the runes to those who had never heard a god's name. He wove stories not to preserve himself, but to ensure something survived him. Because that in the end was what wisdom meant, not possession, but continuation. A flame passed, not kept. He returned once more to Mimir, not to drink, but to speak. "Mimir," he said, "tell me what wisdom is worth when the wise all die." And the head ancient and half asleep replied, "It is worth everything, because only through dying do the wise plant seeds." He returned once more to Yggdrasil, not to hang, but to listen. The tree did not speak, but it leaned, and he understood. It was not enough to know the end. He had to become it, not as victim, as vessel. He began to guide his people subtly, slowly. He hardened the warriors of Valhalla, not for victory, but for resistance. He whispered of hope, not as false comfort, but as rebellion. He sent Baldur to Helheim, yes, allowed it, because he saw that only through death could light return. He even allowed Loki to live, knowing that chaos was not an enemy, but a mirror. He did not stop the flow of fate. He steered into it like a ship into a storm, eyes open, arms steady. And when the signs came, when the winter did not end, when the sun turned black, when the roosters crowed from Asgard Jotunheim, and Hel Odin did not panic, he stood. He donned his armor not to be saved, but to be seen. He rode Sleipnir not to flee, but to arrive. He gathered the dead of Valhalla and led them into battle, not as soldiers of salvation, but as witnesses of truth. And when Fenrir came, when the wolf he had once tried to raise, then chained in fear, opened his jaws to swallow the sky, Odin met him, not with terror, with peace. He did not flinch when the jaws closed, because he knew death was not failure. It was fulfillment. In the moment of his ending, the runes blazed in the air, not to stop the end, but to mark it. To remind all who watch that wisdom, true wisdom, must pass through sacrifice. The world burned, the gods fell, the tree trembled, and still beneath the ash, something stirred. Because Odin had left more than blood behind. He had left knowing. He had passed it into the wind, the roots, the voices of mortals. He had placed questions into the hearts of those who would rebuild. He had shown that power was never in dominance, but in decision. That the greatest thing a god can do is not live forever, but die for something greater than themselves. And when a new sun rose brighter, clearer, free of prophecy, his name was not shouted. It was whispered. By a child who asked why the storm did not return. By a mother who sang runes she did not know how she knew. By a wanderer who stared at a tree and wept. And so Odin lived not in body, not in temple, but in choice. The choice to seek, to question, to change. That was the wisdom he gave. That was the legacy he left. Not a crown, a path.